what advice do you have to people starting out their careers in the arts at the moment?
Well, it really depends which bit of the industry you want to work in. If you want to work in theatre, if you want to work in television, if you want to write novels, if you want to do journalism,
Yeah.
obviously it's all different, and it's very, very difficult at the moment. There isn't, nothing going on at all. But if you're a writer, you can write, and it's a good opportunity. It's so quiet, and nobody ever rings you up. Nothing going on, so all you can do is write. And particularly when you're a young person, the main thing is that you write a lot, and you get into the habit of doing it every day. It's like being a dancer or a footballer. You limber up and you do it every day in some form or another, and you have to get into the habit of doing that. But the main thing is to write a lot when you're young, just to get experience. Write and write and write and write in whatever form you choose, or in many forms. If the world ever goes back to work, is to really learn from older people. I worked in the theatre a lot when I was young, and I was very young. I was in my early 20s, but I worked with directors and actors who knew much more than I did, and just rinsed them for information and knowledge. When I worked at the Royal Court, I just used to sit in the pub next door to the Royal Court, and all the writers would come in and out, and I'd just sit next to them and ask them questions about, how do you get going? How do you get an agent? How do you do this? How do you do that? And that's really helpful to work. I came from the suburbs. I'd never met any writers before. So coming to London and meeting up with other writers and hearing their stories and getting their advice was really, really helpful for me.
Did you find that people were quite receptive when you were there asking for their time in terms of questions and trying to get advice from them?
Mostly they're really nice. Actually, mostly people are really nice. If you're 18 and you go up to another writer and say, can you tell me a bit about how you got started and what happened? Most of them will be really nice. I can remember the ones that weren't. They were a bit standoffish, but actually, they know what it's like. Older people know what it's like. They've been through the system, and they got good advice for you about um, agents or publishers or theaters or whatever, and they can tell you who might be useful to you, who might help you, who might get in contact with.
How did you get into writing, which is a bit of a broad question, but particularly working within theatre and writing for the theatre?
When I was 18, I wrote a letter. I think I was 18. Yeah, I wrote a letter to the Royal Court, and I sent them a play, and they wrote back to me, and they invited me up.
Wow.
So I went up to the Royal Court, where I'd never been before, and I got a job. And they gave me a job as a script reader. So I had to read all these big scripts and write reports on them, and I'd go in and sit at the meetings and talk about the plays, etc., etc. So they were very generous and very kind to me, and it was really good for me to get out of my house, my family house, and be with other people who were creative, which, as I say, I'd never really met before.
Mm.
And so I began to feel part of the industry, of the business, and I began to see, not only how to write a play, but how the whole business worked, of finding a director, getting a play on, the reviews, finding the actors, casting, and all of that stuff. That was really useful to me, and it was far more useful than it would have been for me to sit at home on my own,
Yeah.
isolated, just writing, because I got a lot of good advice from people, and I would advise you to show your work to other people, maybe to friends, but much better to professional people, directors, producers, maybe other writers, critics who might read your work and say something useful. You just want, just a little bit of encouragement from someone, so that you believe, that you're not entirely on your own.
I think that's what people are struggling with quite a lot at the moment for obvious reasons, this feeling of isolation. But there are plenty of outlets currently out there to share your work. You mentioned that you started in theatre. How did you then turn to writing novels, and did that feel like a completely different approach?
Well, I worked in the theatre, and then I did a few plays, but I couldn't make a living.
Mm.
Just having a play on here and there now and again. I mean, it's nothing. The money, it was terrible, and it was really hard. And then Channel 4 started, and they were making films. They didn't have any writers, and so they knew me from the theatre, I guess, and so they commissioned me to write a film. And in those days, I was the ethnic minority, so I
Mm.
got the ethnic minority work. That really helped me, and also the stories I had to tell hadn't been told yet, really. So I got the gig doing My Beautiful Laundrette.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I'd left university, I think in 77. My Beautiful Laundrette was like 84. So, during those years, it was quite tough to survive financially. And I worked in theaters, and I worked backstage, and stuff like that to make a living. I was a stage manager for a bit,
Oh,
but it was
really?
quite tough. Yeah, it was ages until I actually had any real money. One of my kids, who's 25, he's just got a great job. He's become a script writer on a soap opera,
Oh, cool.
and that's good pay. I mean, he earns more than I do, and he writes one a month, and he gets good money, and it's great experience. And they got like 27 writers on this soap opera. Obviously, they don't meet in person at the moment, but he talks to all the other writers. He sees how the show's put together. He knows the actors. It's a fantastic gig for him. It's just a great experience. Every day you learn something new. So getting a gig like that, as I say, on all those soap operas and TV shows, they've got a lot of writers. It's not the sort of thing that I could do, but
Mm.
it's really good for a young person.
Once you've got your foot in the door, almost like we talked about with your experiences in the theatre, you can then start to snowball your career a little bit and build upon experiences.
Well, there's far more opportunities for young writers today than there were when I was a kid. There's a lot of TV output, as you know, being made now by all those TV channels, Amazon, Netflix, Sky, blah blah blah, and the British channels.
Yeah.
And you could do that and earn some money. And while you're doing that, while my kid is writing soap operas, he's also working on his own stuff, which is the main thing. He has time. So it's really good to get a steady gig like that if you're a young person, I think.
I think Channel 4 have a really good playwright scheme as well, don't they? I think, and things like that. Do you know of any particular schemes or anything like that that are ones
Yeah,
people
well,
look out for?
I've just got involved with a company called Out of Joint,
Okay.
which is a theatre company, and they've just started a writer's room. So they got 6 writers in there called the Stock Room, and they sit in there and they write plays together, and they get paid. They're on a contract. So, if you look around, I'm sure there are places and opportunities that you might be able to find.
Through the podcasts, we've been gathering these connections and finding out of opportunities that we can share with people, really, about what's currently out there.
We've got a big industry in this country of cinema and television, also journalism, and a lot of novels are published in this country. There's a lot of space for young writers. It's not as though it's impossible to get through. If you're talented and you're eager and you work hard and you've got stories to tell, I'm sure that you could find someone to be interested in you.
Well, what would you potentially say to anyone who would, is finding it difficult as a writer to find inspiration in the current circumstances?
Well, it is. It's really tough.
Yeah, well, yeah.
On the other hand, what's been happening at the moment, the last year or so, is incredibly interesting. You should be able to find a story in what's happened, and should be inspired by this. I was walking around the streets just now, and you see everyone walking around in masks, and you think a year ago it would never have occurred to me that everybody in Hammersmith would be wearing a huge mask over their head. So these are very, very interesting times. They're terrible, but they're really interesting for a writer, and people's relationships have changed. Relationships with their children, with their parents, with their lovers, their friends, and so on. Everything has changed quite dramatically. So you should be able to dig a story out of out of this catastrophe. Catastrophes are really good for writers.
I suppose so. I suppose it's changed things on both an intimate scale and quite a global scale in that respect, what the pandemic's achieved. Not
It's
achieved.
really linked together. What you've just said is really interesting. It's really linked together your, your private destiny with the medical destiny of the rest of the world. Absolutely, we're all in the same thing. So it's a great opportunity for writers to start to think, how do I tell a story about what's been going on in the last year?
Mm.
Where would I start? How could I focus that? Who are the characters that I think could speak for me and tell and talk about the things that I want to show? So I wouldn't want to think that it would be difficult to find inspiration. I think it's such a fascinating thing. Obviously, you can write about the past, about your own past,
Mm.
or whatever. But I think what's going on at the moment is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's, we've all kind of gone on our own path to get to where we are now, and whilst the pandemic's affecting us all in different ways, there's still
Yeah,
that kind of united sense of going through a shared experience as such.
yeah. I think there's going to be a huge outpouring of work. I don't know when or whether this will come to an end. Maybe by next autumn. But I think there's going to be a huge outpouring of really interesting work by people who have been through the most extraordinary, strange, painful, interesting, funny experiences.
Yeah, I think